I'd like to introduce you to somebody that you probably have never met, and I'm going to do it via the television program here. It's just a resource for identifying a gentleman who wrote a book, which I happened to pick up, and I read it. I was quite impressed by it, and I'm going to structure the sermon today around that book and some of the information that was contained therein, because I thought it was pretty fascinating and pretty interesting. It is my privilege today to get to speak to you about one of my very, 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 very favorite topics. Title of the sermon is Living Like Jesus. My favorite topic. It's a toss-up because I love to talk about that, and I also love to talk about the Ten Commandments, but really, don't you think they're immensely intertwined? If you're going to live like Jesus, you are going to really observe the Ten Commandments as well. This particular gentleman, I'll show you his picture, and you're going to see him live here in a moment as Jeff works on things. This is the book, and you can see that he is of a very slight build, wearing glasses, and he has a long beard. He looks a little bit sickly, and I will describe that why he does. Because he has Lou Gehrig's disease, and he's had it for some time. I went on the internet to try to find out if he is still alive. As far as I could tell, he is still alive, although it was initially predicted that he might just live 5 to 7 years. And this book was written in 2009, and it's a story about what happened, I presume, in the year 2008. Title of the book, The Year of Living Like Jesus. The Year of Living Like Jesus. I would share with you that he is a Northern Irish-American pastor who was formerly associated with the Moral Majority. That's Jerry Falwell. I think all of you are familiar with that. He became disillusioned with them, although he always retained a respect for Jerry Falwell. So he left their organization, and he became a pastor of a large megachurch up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. It was there that he was diagnosed apparently with ALS, or Lou Gehrig disease, and since then has gone on to be a book writer and a speaker and be on TV and so forth and so on. It's one thing, you know the old saying, don't judge a book by its cover. I don't know what this man would be like to be around, but I've gotten to know him through his book. And there's a sense of intimacy, knowing how he thinks and how he reasons as a result of this particular book, which is very easy to read. And I would just say right up front that I obviously do not agree with some of his positions. You know, he is a Sunday keeper. I am not. He does not observe the dietary laws. I do. He does not keep the holy days. I do. So forth and so on. However, for 1 year he did. For 1 year he did, because he is able to discern, when you read the scripture, that if you are going to live like Jesus for 1 year, guess what you will do? Isn't that interesting? You will do those very things which I just mentioned to you that he did for 1 year. So Jeff, if you're ready, I'd like the congregation to at least give me about 3 minutes long, a little introduction. You'll hear his voice. You'll get to see him. And also there's some poignant observations that he gives in this presentation, which is basically to tell you about his book. We just forget that. We can turn. You can buy the book if you want to, but I think I will call out the majority of it for you that you will find useful. All right, let's turn out the lights, and I'd like you to meet him. His name is Ed Dobson.
One doctor's visit changed Ed Dobson's life forever.
I'm being told I have 2 to 5 years to live, most of it in the disabled condition.
His only prescription? To walk, talk, and live like Jesus for 1 year.
Instead of getting up every morning and wondering which muscle doesn't work that worked yesterday, I would get up every morning focused on trying to live like Jesus.
Living with Lou Gehrig's disease meant this former pastor would lose his religion to find a relationship.
What I was trying to do for the first time was try to eliminate all of the religious, theological, denominational constraints and go back to what Jesus said and see if it's possible to follow that.
Would this new way of life allow him to finally embrace his Savior?
I'm not asking God to heal me. I'm throwing myself on the mercy of God.
As the year went on, we saw the beard get longer and we hear these funny stories.
I ate kosher, which is a pain in the neck. I observed the Sabbath, which is a pain in the neck.
But it was also very serious. And we began to see the people that he was influencing as a result of this journey he was on.
I didn't know everything it would entail, so I couldn't question everything.
As I read the Gospels, I decided maybe I should try to obey them.
There were times when I'd think, oh my goodness, where is this going to take him mentally and spiritually?
But can anyone truly follow Jesus' steps?
He's a man who's trying to remain true to the scriptures and true to the attitudes of Jesus. And I don't know how you can do better than that, regardless of what you do.
And after all, he was God, so he had a slight advantage.
Discover the impact of a year of living like Jesus.
I found it to be really powerful. I felt at times like I was caught up in the story, that I was really standing there listening to Jesus.
And what it takes to really find faith.
I don't think I really care what they think about me. Ultimately, what matters is what they think about Jesus. And if in this crazy, wild experiment, someone picks up the Bible and thinks, I ought to read the Gospels, to me, that will be the redeeming factor.
All right, thank you. Thank you for watching that. So you had a little bit of an introduction to this gentleman. And as I mentioned to you before, even though we would disagree on some theological concepts, actually on several, I believe that we could sit in the same room and have a healthy debate. And though we would disagree with each other, we would still leave the room caring for each other. And I think there's something to be said for that. I think about those of us in the Church of God culture. We've got a long way to go in the Church of God culture. And I'm not exactly sure how we got to where we are, but we do have a long way to go. He did and can and does a fellowship with Catholics, Protestant, evangelicals, and Muslims, and so forth. Those of us in the Church of God movement are finding it difficult even to fellowship with each other in the various Church of God groups, and we claim that we are God's true church. Isn't that interesting? So when I read this, I got to thinking about where his emphasis was, and one of the emphasis that he speaks about frequently in this book comes right out of the Sermon on the Mount, which is that we are to learn to love our enemies. And I want you to just think about that. We are to love our enemies. And he makes the case that Jesus was a great peacemaker. And I agree with that 100%. But it's difficult because sometimes we, the Church of God people, are not even welcome 10 miles away. And I really have trouble getting my mind around that. Now, the Church of God International has made some important strides trying to tear down those barriers and those walls that separate people, and the result has been very, very good. Just think back to the number of speakers that we've had here toward the end of the year from various church organizations. Very good, very good. I think about Mr. Wayne Cole being here. Of course, I don't think of him as being part of another organization. He's part of our family. That's all there is to it, and the different ones we heard. But as I read this book, I realized that I have a lot of room for improvement. A lot of room for improvement. To live every day like Jesus did. Now, let's think about just this morning. All right? Just go with me this morning. Did your morning go like it should have gone? Do you think Jesus would have lived your your morning in the way that you did? With what came out of here? With what you observed? What you heard? How you drove? Every little aspect of our life. And this gentleman details in about this, 200 or 300 pages, I don't really know, about 290 pages or so long, his venture of living like Jesus for 1 year. And I would like to share some excerpts from that with you in a moment, but I was thinking about this morning at our house. We got up at a decent hour. I got up at before Betsy, because she likes to sleep in on the Sabbath day, and normally when you have a sermon, those of us who preach, we got to get up, and we've got to sort of get after it. And I think Jesus would do that. I think he'd be up earlier. If he had married, I think he'd let his wife sleep in. I think he would. I think about, we think he went so far in this presentation in his year of living like Jesus that he changed his dress, his clothing, and he dressed like a Jew. Now, I don't think Jesus would dress like that today. I think that if Jesus walked in this room here today, that he'd be pretty much just like all of us in this room. But for the point of the experience, he changed his dress. He did not shave. He chose not to shave. He did observe the kosher laws and so forth, and it was rather impactful. Back to this morning. I looked around our house where we are. I have no pictures of Jesus on the wall. No pictures of Jesus on the wall. And some people want to have pictures of Jesus on the wall. That's your call, but I would like you to think about how would Jesus do that? Would Jesus, if he got up in your home, would he look at a picture on the wall of something that is not him? Because all of us are mistaken if you think those pictures that we see of Jesus are the way he looked. He is not a white European, was he? He was not a white European. Something that's brought out in this book, which I never really even thought about, to you, you're probably aware of it, it's just something I had not thought about until I read it, is he says that the Catholic faith, the people in the Catholic Church, are pretty much caught up with Jesus on a crucifix. I don't have a crucifix in my home. I don't have one hung up. And he said the reason they do that is the Catholics focus on Jesus' suffering. He says the evangelicals, though, and the Protestants, they don't have Jesus on a crucifix. They have just a cross. And he says the difference is one points to Jesus' suffering, the other points to the resurrection, that Jesus is not on the cross. You see that? I don't have any crosses in my house. I don't have any need for that. I don't know that Jesus would have. Do you think Jesus would have any crosses in his house? Do you think? I don't know. I don't see it. That's just me personally. I don't see it. So if you really want to take a look at how we're supposed to live like Jesus, I think it does take us into our homes, our cars, our jobs, the restaurants we go to, the relationships with our children, relationships with our parents, relationships with those we work with. It's pretty extensive, don't you think? It just permeates everywhere. It's good to think about that and then come back to the reality of the long, 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 long journey that we are on, because we are committed to live like Jesus permanently, not just for 1 year. A couple little excerpts I hope you will enjoy from his observations. He raises just an excellent question at the very beginning of the book. He says, what if we were to push past all the labels and get back to the idea of just being a follower of Jesus? He says that when people ask him, is he a evangelical, he doesn't like that term. He doesn't like the term Christian, although he recognizes that it is biblical. He doesn't like the term Baptist either. So he says when people ask him, what are you? He says, I'm a follower of Jesus. I like that. I like that. I'm a follower of Jesus. So if we push back all the labels, what would a follower of Jesus look like? So he proposes, as I mentioned, to eat like Jesus, wear clothes that Jesus might have worn. He does keep the holy days, and he tries his very best to behave like Jesus would. Is it impossible? He says, well, yes and no. I thought you would find this interesting about his beard, because we have bearded ones in our audience here today. which is fine. He was in a little bit of confusion about growing a beard and then also how to trim it. Now, some of this is Jewish practice, and the reason why I bring this out to you is because to me, I have trouble grappling with some of the Jewish practices that are extant today, because to me, they fit into that section of Scripture where Jesus said, "Howbeit in vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrine the commandments of who? Of men." So lots of things tied up with that. Nonetheless, in trying to live like Jesus, he decided to talk to a rabbi about his beard. And I'd like to share with you what the rabbi does with his beard. Do all of you know what the Jewish people do if you're devout, trying to live like Jesus, what you would do with your beard? This comes out of his journey. This is actually what he does. He does January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, and so forth through the entire year. And he tells about different events that take place inside that first year. So obviously the beard comes up right away. He says today, this is day 21, he's going to talk to the rabbi. The rabbi has short hair, short beard, and they've been friends a long time. And he tells him he's made a commitment to live like Jesus, and the rabbi responds to that very positively. Then he says this, he asked the rabbi, he says, "Why does the Torah, that is the law, which the Jewish people live by, say we're not supposed to cut the hair at the sides of our head or clip off the edges of our beard?" The rabbi responds immediately, and he said, one perspective is this. He said, is that it is a prohibition within the context of pagan death rituals. The pagans would cut themselves for the dead. They would shave the sides of their heads and pluck out their beards. That was simply the pagan custom when someone died. So the prohibition is actually against pagan rituals and customs. By Jesus' time, he added, men grew out their beards and didn't cut them at all. But interesting, the rabbi had a neatly trimmed beard. So I wondered if perhaps he, the rabbi, was in violation of this specific command. So he said, "I hope this is not an offensive question," I said, "but what about you?" He laughed. He said, "Not at all. It's not offensive at all." He said, "That's a very good question. I think that it's a prohibition against using a razor on one's beard, but not against using scissors. So I trim my beard with an electric razor that uses a scissors action to cut, but I would never allow a razor blade to touch my beard." Go figure. Go figure. Nothing against beards whatsoever. I think all of you know that. But how we reason. Now, I'd like for the beginning of the sermon today to have you turn to Mark chapter 1 and verses 16 through 17. As you're turning there, I would like to look at the congregation, those of you who are here today, and tell you something that you probably are not aware of. Those of us in the ministry think about you a lot. We think about you as we drive. We think about you in our prayers. We talk about you in our conversations. And I look at this congregation over all these many years, and I look at you and where you've been, and here you are. I look at the trials and the tribulations, the blessings, the losses, all the things that you've gone through the years. I just want you to know that our ministry in this church cares about you, and we think about you, and we are prayerful over you, because we recognize, although you have gotten to this point, it is our privilege and our obligation to finish the race, to use the language of the Apostle Paul. Here in Mark chapter 1, verse 16, this is the calling of disciples. Verse 16, "Now as he walked by the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew, his brother, casting a net into the sea, for they were fishermen." Now, verse 17, Jesus said to them, and there are three verbs here that I want you to focus on that imply what it is to be a follower of Jesus. First of all, he says, "Come you." All right? In the Greek, this word "come you" means come here. In other words, stop doing what you're doing, which is, they were fishing and in the boats and so forth. Stop doing that and come here. It was necessary for them to leave their nets, their boats, and their occupation to follow Jesus. After that, it says this. It says, "Come, you, after me." Actually, other translations of that mean, come behind me. Come behind me. Why behind him? Because if they were going to be a follower of Jesus, they need to be within his shadow, if I may put it that way. Or some of you have seen it, that particular poem about in his footsteps. You're not over to the right. You're not over to the left. You are directly behind him. So leave what you're doing. Come and get behind me. Follow me. Then the third verb that's in here, as it says here in verse 17, "And I will make you come." Jesus said unto them, "Come you after me, and I will make you to become fishers of men." And straightway they forsook their nets and they followed him. And what that means, if you check the Greek on that particular verb means they attach themselves to Jesus. So you get the picture here. If you're going to be a disciple of Jesus, a follower of Jesus, you're going to stop what you're doing. You are going to come. You are going to get behind Jesus. You're going to follow wherever he goes, and you will be attached to him. Have you ever seen a dad with a son, a little boy? I remember years ago watching Mark Armstrong and his little boy. I've forgotten his name now. What is it? Michael Allen. Do you all remember when Michael Allen was just a little bitty boy? Just no bigger than this? And I remember in our office over on South Broadway, one day Mark was talking and I was watching Mark Allen. And Mark was gesturing, and every time Mark would do something, Mark Allen would imitate him. And next thing you know, Mark Allen was over there. Mark was there, and he had his finger on it. He had his hand on his hip and looked over there, and guess what Mark Allen had? It was just like he was completely mimicking or imitating and attached to Mark. And so when Mark left, guess what? Mark Allen just went along with him. So you see the idea? Stop what you're doing. Come and get behind me. He's going to lead us. And then be attached to me. That's what's involved at the outset with discipleship. Now, at the beginning of this book, I'd like to share with you what most of us would sort of deal with in our daily experience, I think. It's easy to change on the outside, isn't it? Where's it tough to change? In here and up here. Here's an illustration of that. His journey began January 1st, 2008. I presume it was that year. He and his wife flew to Florida that particular day, and on the way to the airport, they were stopping at a stoplight. When it turned green, the person in front of him just sat there. So, what'd he do? Aggressively. He honked the horn. Now, this is on day one of living a year like Jesus. Day one. He said, "I honked the horn, not a very Jesus thing to do." It seems to me that Jesus was kind and patient with others. He never seemed to be in a hurry. And then on the plane, he said, "I struggled with the decision to shut off my iPod. After all, the flight attendant couldn't see me. Still, as much as I wanted to keep listening to the Gospels," because that's what he was listening to on the iPod, "I decided to turn the iPad or iPod off." He says, "I was surprised by how much of a struggle it was. Part of me felt that listening to the Bible was far more important than obeying some rules of airline safety." You know what they tell you on an airplane? They used to. Now you can listen to some of it. But back then you had to turn off all the electrical equipment. He said, I was surprised how much of a struggle that was. He said, but listening would be deceptive. And deception is not living like Jesus. Day one. On day 4, he said, things did not go well at lunch today. And this is him getting involved with kosher food. He said his wife Lorna, who you saw on the screen, made a salad today, and after the meal, I told her how good it tasted, to which she replied, well, I was wondering. You didn't say a word during the entire meal. Your dad was just like that. And I'm hoping you won't be like him. The reason, though, I was so quiet was that I was so focused on what I had just been listening to from the Gospels of Luke and John that my mind was racing a mile a minute. He says, I'll have to be careful in the future so that I don't get so consumed with thinking about following Jesus that I forget to love the people around me. Jesus, he says, was really into people. He says, I need to be into people as well. That's on day 4. Interesting concepts about the Sabbath, and because we're Sabbatarians and Sabbath keepers, I thought I would share some of this information with you, not only to reassure you why you do what you do, but to also show you some of the struggles and the other ways in which people deal with observing Shabbat. He says that this is the Sabbath evening, and this is his first Sabbath he's going to be observing. He says that's a 24-hour period each week when Jews do not work. So at 6 o'clock, we went into the service. It was a wonderful experience. As we went through the prayer book for Shabbat in English and not Hebrew, I was struck by how many times it talks about what subject would you think? Justice. Justice. I was also struck by the connectedness Jews have to past generations. After we drank a glass of kosher wine, I guess that's Mogan David Deluxe. I'm not sure what that is. I guess that's wine that's been blessed by the rabbi, is what that is. I would think so. But he said, I was after I drank a glass of kosher wine, I looked into the face of those Jewish people and realized they were the actual racial descendants of Jesus and the apostles. Now, on day 31, so this is January, I just wanted to show how he started and how he ended. On day 31, he and his wife flew back to Florida. On the way, I finished listening to the Gospel of John, which meant I've read through the Gospels 5 times this month. I don't know if I'm proud of myself or just relieved that I've finally finished a whole month trying to live like Jesus. 1 month. Maybe a little bit more pride than relief. I began the month by honking at people who were too slow when the light turned green, and I've ended the month being proud of myself. Not very Jesus-like. So you begin to see how his thinking is filtering into just everything that he's doing, because he is wearing the clothes, he is eating the food, he is studying the Bible, he is aware of other people and what they're doing. He does make the case very clearly in the book that the Sabbath is a day in which we rest from our work and our creation, that we don't create anything. You know, when you work, you create things, and he makes that point that the Sabbath is a day not to be involved in work or creating, because that's what God abstained from doing. I thought all of you in the room would enjoy this. How did he and how did the Jewish rabbi and his family keep the Sabbath and prepare for the Sabbath day? Just a brief excerpt there, since we're all experts at Sabbath keeping. I think we should be. Something I did not fully realize. In talking to the rabbi, he says, how do you prepare food and observe the Sabbath? Well, the rabbi smiled. He said, actually, my wife does most of it. There you go. So I thought there's not much difference between a Jew and a Gentile. Both of our wives do most of the work. First, he said, I make sure that all the work for the next day is done ahead of time. Then before the sun goes down, I turn on the oven. No, before the sun goes down, I turn on the oven, turn on the hot plate, and the hot water urn. I turn on the lights that will be necessary. For example, the one in the bathroom, because you're not allowed to turn on lights in Jewish practice on the Sabbath day. He says we're not allowed to turn switches on and off during Shabbat. I then unscrew the refrigerator light so it will not come on when the door is open. And you thought keeping the Sabbath the way we do it is tough, huh? He says we eat the Shabbat meal together, and afterwards we'd read or play kids' games. He says I try to go to bed early. We get up in the morning, eat breakfast, and walk to the synagogue. I usually get home by 1 p.m. Sometimes I take a nap after lunch. Sometimes I play games with the kids. Sometimes I read the newspaper. Sometimes I go for a bike ride. But when I ride the bike, I have to be careful. If I ride the bike on a soft trail and leave a trail mark, that would be a violation of Shabbat. So I generally ride on hard pavement. So Ed says, so you actually spend most of the Sabbath sleeping. He said, exactly. And then he goes on to mention this, that the Sabbath is meant to be. And I just wanted to bring this out to all of us today who are observing the Sabbath. The Sabbath, according to Isaiah 58, verses 13 through 14, which you know well. What is the Sabbath really meant to be? A day of D-E-L-I-G-H-T. A day of delight. He says, but nearly everything I have read about the Sabbath, as well as everything Jews who practice it consistently have told me, convinces me that the Sabbath is certainly something to be enjoyed. And it is to be a delight. So today we're adding to that delight by having a little bit of chili. I even wondered, would Jesus eat chili? Well, I hope so. Of course, I do think he would, or we would be doing it here today. He goes on to talk about later on some of the things that are important in the text of Jesus' teaching, and that is one of the concepts and the beliefs that we have in the kingdom of God, and that we're practicing the kingdom of God rules when and where? Now and here. Now and here. We're practicing those rules as we know them and understand them. One of the things then about keeping the Sabbath that I thought you would find interesting, they play games on the Sabbath, and of course, as Ed was quick to bring out, he's very competitive and he likes to win. So he was confused as to how in the world would they keep score, because you're not able to take a pencil, if you're an observing Jew, you're not able to take a pencil up and to keep score. You're not able to write. Okay? So how do you think that, what do you think the rabbi said was the solution to that? The way you do it is, he says, you take a book, and if you've got 274 points, you put a bookmarker at page 274. Or if you've got 170 points, you put the bookmarker at page 170. So that's how you legally can keep the Sabbath and play bingo, or whatever it is game that you play on the Sabbath day, because you cannot write. So some of that I think we can appreciate their zeal, but remember, these people are actually practicing it and doing it, as Ed was quick to observe. Now, one of the things which you, I think, would want to know, and this is a concept which I want us to dwell upon and think about, because all of us in this room have afflictions every now and then. Some of them very serious. Some of them even terminal. He has Lou Gehrig's disease. He knows he is dying. So his expression of faith and healing and God's part in his life, I think, is worth hearing, and I'd like to share a little bit of that with you and see what you think about it. He dwells on the difference between healing and being cured. You ever thought about that? The difference between being healed and being cured. On a trip in Israel, he takes a group of people to Israel with him, and they're wandering around, and of course there's lots of places there that are very, very special. And one such place was Bethesda. And there you find the ancient pool that can still be seen and so forth. Mickey, you've seen it, I'm sure, when you were over there. He said it was the Sabbath when Jesus healed the man, and the Jewish law forbids any work on the Sabbath. Picking up your mat would have been considered work. So the Jews were upset with Jesus. He says, I talk about the subject of divine healing and suggest that it's possible. Now listen carefully. This is worth discussion. You know, this is a good topic for the Sabbath. I talk about the subject of divine healing and suggest that it's possible to be cured but not healed. And I suggest that it's possible to be healed but not cured. In the Gospels is a story of 10 lepers Jesus cured, only one of whom comes back to thank him. All of them were cured, but one was healed. Sort of, you get the imagery here? Paul writes about what he calls his thorn in the flesh. 3 times he prayed to God to remove this thorn, but God doesn't do it. Then Paul discovers that God's grace is sufficient to sustain him even in the face of suffering, so he writes that he will glory in his weakness, because in his weakness God's grace is more than sufficient. Paul was not cured, but he was healed. So that I read that, I thought that sort of makes sense to me a little bit, because sometimes healing is much more important than the cure. Would you agree? And I do see some people sometimes who are not healed, but they are definitely cured, and I see them in this body of believers here. On the film, you probably didn't have time to really notice it, but he does not believe in drinking. But because he recognized that Jesus was a drinker, guess what he decides to do? He decides to go to the bars with the long beard. And he would wear the suit with the tassels. In other words, he would walk into a bar. Now, I have to tell you something. I personally am not comfortable in bars. I don't like going to bars. Sometimes in a nice hotel, you know, they have those little accommodating bars. But the idea of going to a bar where a bunch of people are probably going to be inclined to drink too much, it just doesn't have any appeal to me. But he says, and he raises the question, he said, would Jesus go there? He said, well, he did associate with drunkards and wine bibbers and even prostitutes. Now, he didn't say that he visited any prostitutes, so I want to make that very clear. But he did go to the bar, and I thought that you would enjoy this exchange that he had in the bar. And those of us in the ministry, I have had these types of things happen to me if you go into a place where ministers are not expected to be. And Larry's an expert on those places. No. Let me share with you, I thought we would like this. Page 174. Okay. Okay, let me make sure I've got my place here. Yeah. By the way, I'm not advocating that we all, just one of those things. I'm wrestling with this one. I don't like bars. This was an interesting quote. This takes place in September. He said, I decided to go to a bar with a friend. He's a youth pastor at a local church, and he joined me this year in trying to live like Jesus. In January, he started growing his beard, eating kosher, and reading through the Gospels too, but he only lasted a few weeks. He told me, I can't keep this up. I work at a church full time, so I can't live like Jesus. I love honesty, don't you? That's absolutely honest. All right, just a moment. I'm conscious of our time here. So many interesting little things here. Several days I went back to the same bar, sat at the counter, and ordered a beer. I learned to order light beer because it has less alcohol. Usually I can drink a couple of them. After getting the beer, the bartender started to talk to me. He was short, Jamaican, and in his 50s. He had a small mustache that was slightly gray. He was wearing a Hawaiian shirt, and his laugh was contagious. Hey, I like your beard, he said. How long have you been growing it? I started January 1st of this year. I'll let it grow until December 31st, and then I'm going to cut it. Why are you growing it? Well, this was the opportunity, he says, I was looking for. I made a commitment on January 1st to spend the whole year trying to live like Jesus, so the beard is part of the gig. See, I don't like the word gig either, but it's a popular word. He says, the bartender, a year of living like Jesus. Well, what does that mean? Well, I'm a Jesus follower. I decided to devote a year to doing all these other things that I've shared, and I'm trying to do the best I can to abide by Jesus' teachings. At this point, you could see the shock come over the bartender's face. I suspect he served beer to thousands of people, but I doubt anyone had ever said, I'm trying to live like Jesus. I didn't tell him I was at the bar in the first place because that was part of trying to live out Jesus' teachings. I thought that might be a bit too much for him. After staring at me for a few moments and gathering his thoughts, he continued, "Dude, that's unbelievable. So what are you learning?" Great question. "I'm learning that trying to follow Jesus is a full-time job. I'm learning how difficult it is to actually follow his teachings." Bartender says, "So what's so hard about it?" "That's a great question," he says. "How about loving your enemies? How about caring for the poor, the crippled, the blind, and the lame? How about clothing the naked? How about visiting those in prison? How about visiting the sick? How about feeding the hungry? And how about giving water to the thirsty?" Bartender says, "Right on." He says, "We talked about Jesus and his teachings between his serving other people at the bar. He kept coming back for more conversation. Every time I went back, which I did often, the bartender would introduce me to the others at the bar. 'This guy with the beard is trying to follow Jesus this year,' he said. As a result, I had many wonderful opportunities to talk about my journey with all sorts of people. I thought this was fascinating, I discovered that most people at the bar were interested in Jesus, but they were not interested in the church or religion. Even though I'm a pastor, that didn't seem to matter. What mattered was my personal journey in trying to follow Jesus' teaching. Of course, I never took a Bible to the bar. I simply told my story and what I was learning about Jesus. People were intensely interested in both. Often I began by telling my own story, and then people would chime in with all sorts of questions about the Bible. I've had things like that happen to me before. I remember one time I was with a group of fellows, and we were staying in a nice hotel, and one of the guys was single, and, it was a group of about 10 or 12 of them, and he was over, and he was involved in flirtatious behavior with some girl who was there. As soon as he saw me, he said, hey, he said, "Come over here." And I didn't even want to be there in the first place. And he says, "I want you to meet somebody." And I'm just dying, But you dutifully go over there, and he says, "I want you to meet so-and-so, this young lady." And I said, "Hi, how are you?" And he says, "He's a preacher." Her eyes got big. She said, "He is?" And I said, yeah, I am. She says, "And you go to church?" I said, "Yes, I do." And of course, then that gave me an opportunity to do what? To explain to her that I went to church on the Sabbath. And the next thing you know, the most curious thing occurred. This is not the reason I share this with you, is somewhat recent this occurred. She completely left the guy who was flirting with her, and she said, "Do you mind if I talk to you a while?" And I said, "Well, sure, that's okay." And I'm conscious, because all the guys that I'm with are watching me go away with this woman, and I'm worried about Betsy finding out and all this kind of thing. So we get over there, and she says, she said, "I've had a pretty tough year this year." And I said, "I can understand that. My year's pretty tough right now." But no, I didn't say that. She said, "I've had a pretty tough year." And I said, "Really?" And she said, "Do you mind if I talk to you about religion a little bit?" And I said, "Sure, I'd love to have that discussion." So we talked for about an hour and a half, just about religion, what happened in her life, her philosophy, what she was going to be doing, and so forth. And I thought, isn't that interesting, You never know, do you? You never know. And that's a little bit of what he's sharing here, being at the bar. He goes on to try to wrap things up, bring it to a close, because I do want to make a point with you. He talks about keeping the holy days, the Feast of Trumpets, something that the Jews practice. And I didn't know this until I read this in the book. Prior to the Feast of Trumpets, Rosh Hashanah, the Jews have a service, and one of the activities they do is they go and visit a cemetery where their loved ones are buried in advance of trumpets. Did you know that? I did not know that. And I thought about that, and I thought that's sort of, I like that, There's nothing wrong with that, because there's something pretty sobering that takes place at the cemetery, which, if you understand the meaning of the Feast of Trumpets, pictures exactly what's going to happen to all those folks that are buried in the grave. So he talks about something he did after learning of this. He said he didn't go with them to the Jewish cemetery, but he went to visit his own mom and dad where they were buried. And when he went there, he hadn't been there for years, and he broke down and he wept and he cried and he talked to his mom and his dad. And he lamented all the things that he had missed with them. So he kept the Passover. He talks about atonement. He says he doesn't understand how anybody could keep atonement. Just couldn't keep atonement. But he managed to get through that as well. So let me bring things to a little bit of a conclusion here. In the interviews after the year was over, he was asked repeatedly, "What have I learned?" I'd like you to listen to his answer. He says, "I've learned how difficult it is to follow Jesus' teaching. This year I found out that following the way of Jesus is very difficult. It's nearly impossible. But it is doable. He, Jesus, wants us to live like him, act like him, talk like him, pray like him, and he wants you to think like him." I was reading through the first chapter of Romans, and one little statement in the book of Romans, just you're aware of it, the Apostle Paul, in talking about the church at Rome and the Christians there, he said that they were known by their, do you remember what it says? That all over the world, he says, "I give thanks that you are known in the world for your faith." And that prompted me to do something which I want all of you to do, if you can, either today or tomorrow. I think Jesus would allow this. I thought, well, I wonder why we, the Church of God International, are thought of in the world. So I went to Wikipedia. I clicked on Church of God International, and up came an article about us. Because whether you are in Argentina, whether you are in China, whether you are in North America, South America, wherever you are, you can click on Church of God International, Wikipedia, and that is how we are known around the world. You know what was interesting in that? Well, I'm not. You look it up yourself. I found some very interesting comments that were made there about the Church of God International, most of which I was 100% pleased to see in print. By the way, we're indebted to Jeff for doing that because he worked with all the people to get the errors out of what was in there, and basically what you see there is the truth. So I was thinking about, well, what are we known for? Well, there it is on Wikipedia. It made me think about how it is. It's really easy to do judging. He makes the comment in this particular book. He said the most difficult group of people that he had to explain a year of living like Jesus to were who? Christians. Catholics, Protestants, Baptists. He says the religious people are the ones who are most judgmental. And yet what was he doing? He was living like Jesus. He wasn't hurting anybody. He wasn't saying anything that shouldn't be said. He wasn't asking anybody to do something that they didn't want to do. And yet he got accused of all sorts of things, almost like being a fanatic. Well, we don't wear the beards and so forth and so on, but I think all of us are familiar with persecutions and mockings. I love this little story about, it's really easy for us as ministers to get up and talk to you about your faith and ask you to do this, and you have to wonder whether or not we're doing the same. A man had a member of his congregation. Her name was Mrs. Young, and she did this for a long time. She was always talking about her worry over her husband's attitude toward her coming to church. And so this particular day, Mrs. Young came up to the preacher and said to him, "I am so scared. My husband Joe says that he's going to kill me if I continue to go to your church." The minister said, "Well, I certainly understand that," and he was a little bit tired of hearing it over and over again. He says, I'll pray for you, and Mrs. Young, I'll pray that your faith will be strong, and that your faith, God will see your faith and will protect you." She said, "Oh yes, he's kept me safe so far, no question about that, but," she said, "so far." The preacher said, "What do you mean so far?" He says, "Well, now my husband is saying if I keep coming to church, he's going to kill you." And the minister said, "Well, perhaps it is time to check out the little church on the other side of town." The preacher suddenly had lost a little bit of his faith, hadn't he? It's true, many times we are faced with difficulties and our faith seems to go out the window. Now our faith, what I'm talking about here today with all of you, is this journey that we're on. that's not yet coming to a close. I have in my briefcase a research paper. Remember I told you about this? That was given to me by a church member about 6 months ago that said that the end of time was 2013. Had mathematical equations, multiplication, so forth and so on. Unequivocally, the year 2013, December 31st, 2013, Jesus was returning. You remember my discussion with you about that? I told him after listening to him, I said, well, that's really interesting and so forth and so on. And he just wouldn't let it go. And I said, stop, 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 stop. I actually said, stop. I don't know if Jesus would have done that or not, but, you know, I was patient for long enough. And I just told him, I said, listen, I said, I'm going to save your paper, and at the end of 2013, when Jesus is not going to come back, has not come back, I'm going to call you. See, I don't think Jesus would have said that. Do you think Jesus would have said that? I don't think so. So I'm not sorry for asking him to stop. I'm sorry that I sort of said, well, I'll call you back and really make him feel bad, even though he deserves it. No, I don't think Jesus would say that either. I'm just getting in trouble here. Okay. You think you cannot finish the journey. Well, you can. You know, 1 year was very difficult for this individual, and then he says, I'm going to go, he says, I'm glad it's all over. Now I can stop living like Jesus. And he goes back and he's doing his Sunday thing and doing whatever he's types of thing. And yet he says, I'm going to try to live like Jesus in his church. And so he is, I'm sure, keeping Sunday and so forth and so on. I'm not going to criticize him for that. It's just an observation. I'm not going to do that. I believe the Sabbath. I believe the things that we are doing here today. But how long will we continue the task before us, this journey? I don't know. I hope we do until we're finished, don't you think? I know of so many people who haven't, and it's distressing. I was reading another article, and I'll just paraphrase. A man in South Florida developed a habit. He'd get up every morning and run 8 miles. He started doing this in 1975. Think about that. Get up every morning on the beaches in southern South Florida, get up and run 8 miles. Every day. Didn't make any difference if hurricanes were there, he ran in the hurricane. So I'm not questioning. This is not about wisdom. This is about what he did. It didn't make any difference if there was hail falling out of heavens during the storm. He ran every day for 8 miles every day since 1975. He has not missed one day. Now just think about that for a moment. Has not missed one day. The reason why I bring that out is I hope none of us miss one day. I hope all of us are able to be steadfast, live like Jesus every single day of our lives to the very, very best of our ability, because that's what is expected of us. Closing text. I would like you to turn to the book of Hebrews. Hebrews, I was reflecting upon this congregation, the ladies here, the men that are here, the young that are, and the old as well. And I recognize how difficult it is for us to do what Jesus wants us to do as often as he expects us to do it. I want you to think as I ask. Think about your home. Think about your family. Think about your clothes. Think about the food you eat. Think about how Jesus expects us to live like him every day, no matter how long it takes. Hebrews chapter 11, at the end of the chapter, it talks about a number of the faithful. And I would like you to notice with me, verse 33, who through faith subdued the kingdoms, they wrought righteousness, they obtained promises, they stopped the mouths of lions, they quenched the violence of fire, they escaped the edge of the sword, out of weakness were made strong, they waxed valiant in fight, they turned to fight the armies of the aliens and so forth. They ran 8 miles every day, all their lives. Women received their dead raised to life again, and others were tortured, not accepting deliverance, that they might obtain a better resurrection. And others had trials of cruel mockings and scourgings, yes, moreover, of bonds and imprisonment. You know, when you go through a terrible trial, one of two things happen. You either get bitter or you get better. You either get bitter or you get better. They were stoned, they were sawn asunder, they were tempted, they were slain with the sword. They wandered about in sheepskins and goatskins, being destitute, afflicted, and tormented, of whom the world was not worthy. They wandered in deserts and in mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. All these, having obtained a good report through faith, received not the promise, God having provided such better things for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. So I want you to think about your journey today, our fellowship, what we have in common here as God's people, and what we have learned. What we have learned. If you ask me, you will get an answer something like this. Since my journey started in 1964. I'll tell you something. I'm heartbroken over my journey. I never thought it would be like it was. I never thought there'd be so much pain. I never thought there'd be so much suffering. I never thought my friends would become my enemies. I never saw it. I never thought the Church of God movement would come to this. By that, you know what I mean by this? I mean, look at what's going on out there. God's people can't even find a way to meet together. And we are the chosen ones. And it just pains me. Maybe one of these days it will change. So if you ask me, I've learned that it really, truly is difficult to abide by Jesus' teachings. It is easier, though, the longer you do it. It is truly easy to change the outside, much more difficult to change the inside. Jesus Christ is the way. He is the way we are to order our lives. He is the way we are to act and to react to each other. He does want us to live like Him, act like Him, talk like Him, pray like Him, and yes, think like Him. Maybe the best way to close this sermon out is with a quote from Mark Twain. A businessman who was well known for his ruthless and inappropriate behavior once told Mark Twain, he says, "Before I die, I mean to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I will climb Mount Sinai and read the Ten Commandments aloud at the top." Mark Twain said, "I have a better idea. Stay in Boston and keep them." Well, let's stay here and keep them. Don't live just a year like Jesus. Live a lifetime.